Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of The Only Way is Ethics. Another great episode and really looking forward to this opportunity. I'd like to welcome Shamoun Ahmad. Thank you for joining us. Been really looking forward to this. So what we're going to do is hand straight over to you, Shamoun, and what we'd like to do is just to give us a bit of background of how you got into digital health, and tell us a bit about Medeskin AI and the organisation, and then we'll get under the bonnet and start chatting around some sort of some topics that are relevant to us in digital health at the moment.
Right. Hello, everyone, as well. My name is Shamoun Ahmad. First off, Dean, thank you for the invite. Looking forward to this chat and everything. So yes, I am the founder and CEO of Medeskin AI. We are a mobile application that uses AI to diagnose skin conditions. And essentially, we are sort of early stage seed. We're sort of running through our trials at the moment in the real world setting, just to test the app and all of its functionalities. So a bit about me and kind of how I got into this space. Well, we'll have to go back a bit down to sort of picking career options when I was younger. And I was sort of interested in medicine specifically. That's actually what I studied. I went into MBBS. I studied medicine and surgery in Italy for 3 years. It was in 2014 is when I started. And if you're familiar with sort of that space at the time, there wasn't much AI going on as there is today. However, 2015, 2016, I want to say, is when Amazon and I believe a cardiologist in New York, you might have to fact check me on that, but they had sort of a collaboration going on, and I forget the exact details on what it was exactly. However, it was sort of implementing AI technologies into the healthcare pathway for cardiology specifically. And that really caught my interest because I was also very much interested in computers. It really came down to a coin toss between sort of medicine and computing, or computers essentially. And it caught my interest, and I was like, okay, this is something new. This sort of joins my two fields together that I enjoy very much. Skip forward to, I want to say 2017, maybe. And a small company at the time by the name of OpenAI released, I believe it was called OpenAI 5. And it was the first time, I believe, that they had released an AI for a video game of all things called Dota, if anyone's familiar with that. It's a very complex game, but it's a video game. At the time, I was sort of into that thing.
Totally.
And they beat sort of the world champion at the time, and I was like, okay, wow, we're really getting there in sort of terms of that. So it came down to then 2017. I made the tough decision to sort of say, all right, I could continue with medicine and get into the field from a doctor perspective, or I take what I have and sort of bolster my technology aspect of it, and then become the bridge itself between AI and medicine. So 2017 to 2021, undergrad and masters in artificial intelligence, and I would say 2021 and sort of working with COVID and everything. Technology became a lot more accessible. Cameras were already on the up and coming, but there really was a push for technology and reducing, your face-to-face interactions to a high level at the time. And I personally was very much interested in cardiology specifically. And I had done, my undergrad final year project was implementing AI technologies in cardiology. my master's was in dentistry, oddly enough, using object detection. And sort of post my master's, it came down to, all right, I am definitely very much still interested in, sort of what's happening in this field. It's still very early stages. It opens up a very, it's just an open door for me to really get in. And so my interests personally have been in image analytics specifically. So as opposed to generative AI, which more people are aware of. My interest has always been in image analytics, and having family members that have dealt with skin conditions, or other life chronic conditions that just don't seem to go away. Close friends had skin conditions that just kept getting misdiagnosed. I think a friend of mine lived with he just rashes just appeared constantly, and he had no idea why until he moved countries and they diagnosed him with something proper, and he's doing much better now. But essentially it worked out really well, and I was like, okay, dermatology is a field that is quite underrepresented. Even in India, which is where I'm from, a lot of the thought process behind dermatological conditions is usually it's okay, it'll go by. It's not really given the care or the attention that more that other domains are essentially. And I think that really sort of helped my resolve in terms of, all right, let's get this to the forefront. It is a relatively underserved domain that I could hopefully make an impact in. And that's where it started. So leading on to where we are now, yes, we have a MVP in place. We currently have a mobile application. Our AI model, based on research, based on sort of talking with healthcare specialists, not only in the UK, but globally, in India, in the Middle East, Southeast Asia. They've all sort of indicated an eagerness to use this application to help them, not replace them, help them with dermatological skin condition diagnosis. So yeah, we have the app up and running. We have our model currently is about 97% accurate, top 3 predictions. And at the moment we are running trials in India actually, just to see how it works in the real world. And the idea is obviously to sort of integrate that into healthcare systems globally.
No, it's absolutely fantastic, and it's really interesting actually hearing your journey, because I think we find through the podcast and through my network, and being obviously worked in digital health for sort of 18 years now, or 19 years it'll be this year, and there's quite a few people that sort of their journey into medicine, and then they sort of almost hit a fork in the road. And that fork always seems to be sort of like a technical computer, sort of like coding. It's quite interesting, and sort of like, no, do I stay in medicine, or do I go the technical route and sort of like do that? And you find both, like sort of in relation to that. And I think it's it's a really interesting concept, and I think it's a benefit for healthcare in relation to sort of like
Absolutely.
there's lots of clinicians that there's this thing, isn't it? Clinicians who code in relation to that, and it puts you front and center. And I think what it also alleviates as well, because I was only discussing this yesterday when we were training, doing the clinical risk management training course, and that fortunately or unfortunately, there are sort of like some developers out there that don't have sort of experience within the healthcare arena, but they look at the digital health sector, and they're like, we can do that, and that can, as we both know, that can be quite dangerous in relation to that, because you don't have if you've got startups that don't have sort of like clinical input or don't have any clinical knowledge, then that can be very dangerous in relation to what we're doing. So
I mean, even as someone who claims to have knowledge, it is a vast and deeply complex beast to tackle. There's no such thing as having sort of completed all your knowledge in this area at all.
No, absolutely, and you're absolutely right, Shamoun, and I agree with you. There's lots of complexities, isn't there, and lots of nuances within healthcare that we need to be aware of. And the only way you can do that is by interacting with the healthcare community
100%.
and being at that, and that includes patients as well.
Oh, absolutely.
In relation to that, because we tend to forget the patient when we're in the design and development life cycle, which I think is it's absolutely key to the success of a lot of digital health systems and applications. So you've got Medeskin AI, and you're in the world of, as we know, AI at the moment, and you've just alluded to the fact, haven't you, sort of like, back in sort of, 2014, and then, you forward winded to 2017. And then you start seeing these sort of like these AI technologies going out. And like you mentioned, this, tiny company called OpenAI, who are now front and center, aren't they? Sort of like, we've just seen the launch of ChatGPT version 5, with a hell of a lot more sort of functions and features in relation to and confidence in relation to what it can do. And I think I mentioned confidence, and I'm gonna talk about sort of so we've had the NHS 10-year sort of like plan that's come out, which speaks about sort of analog to digital. So we're in that digital age, aren't we? We can't get away from it now. It's part of our lives. Sickness to prevention in relation to that, which obviously interestingly puts sort of Medeskin AI at the forefront in relation to that, and hospital to community care, which then also sort of enables our community in relation to sort of having tools and technologies available to them that can sort of like help prevention. You've already mentioned stories around sort of like friends, and we tend to find this, lots of people that come into digital health, it's because they've had their own personal experiences in relation to that, and they see that there's a need, and then they make those positive steps in relation to trying to do something about it, which I think is absolutely fantastic. Now, with the 10-year plan, and also with there's this commitment to have AI-powered skin care cancer pathways. They put a date on this of 2028 in relation to this, and I think we were already talking before we sort of like hit record around sort of like we see a lot of these sort of like I call them loose targets in relation to that. Apologies, the thumbs up come up on my screen there, and for the audience, but in relation to that, so where do you see Medeskin AI in relation to that, and how would that sort of potentially affect your roadmap in and your plans in relation to what you're doing?
So funny enough, really, it's just that a lot of the sort of targeted issues in the 10-year plan happen to be things that we already had in mind. We were already sort of targeting them, and that came down to essentially, boots on the ground, speaking to primary care physicians, speaking to secondary care, speaking to pharmacy, individuals, and a lot of these issues were, I think the 10-year plan sort of lists the three that I remember are reduction in waiting times. I believe there's one related to mental health, and integrating pharmacies into the primary health sphere, if I'm not mistaken. And really two of those three have been our guiding light ever since the beginning. In a lot of in the UK, I will add that caveat. Because it is something that came up time and time again, especially with dermatology. So just to give, drop some statistics midway through this, there are about well, there about 30% of all consultations have an element of skin to them, roughly.
Okay.
And most GPs, so primary care physicians, train up to maybe 2 weeks in dermatology during their sort of, medicine and medical studies, unless you specialize in it, in which case, obviously, that's kind of where you go. So what ends up happening is that in these cases, you as a patient, first, let's say you present yourself with acne. First, it's difficult to get a consultation with your GP. Now, you go to the GP, they sort of, prescribe some steroids, ask you to go on your way. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. In more serious cases, you might run into, the GP not knowing what you might have, and out of precaution, out of, that, they sort of just send you over to secondary care to a dermatologist to take care of something, or an oncologist. Now, you repeat that process again of getting the consultation, going in, et cetera, et cetera. They say, well, this is not what, the GP said, go back down to primary care. You're now probably 2-3 months down the line from where you started. And really, your condition has more than likely gotten worse, if not, if anything. And the opposite is true as well, because what happens is, because people tend to sort of use this precaution to send you forward, a lot of the cases of skin cancer also then have to deal with a blocked system, because people have to be sort of weeded out in terms of, all right, is it cancer? Is it not cancer? So they're inadvertently, their 2-week waiting targets also. However, I think they are now changing the 2-week waiting targets as well.
They have,
yeah. So maybe my terminology is a bit outdated. However,
no.
I believe I get the point across in terms of that,
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
is still affected to some degree. So I am quite, positive on the 10-year plan that the NHS have proposed. However, I will say this. I think it really does come down to their implementation, and how they help, businesses, technologies really get implemented into the system to meet those, targets that they've set forward.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you've I like a stat, and especially for the podcast as well, because we've had some shocking ones on previous ones around sort of like different things when we had the Women in Health Tech podcast. But you've clearly stated 30% of consultations are stimulated. That's a huge amount of consultations in relation to that. And then if you put that in relation to, you said about sort of like that 2 weeks of like possibly on sort of dermatology and sort of like training in relation to that, it doesn't sort of add up, does it? In relation to what we're doing, and how are we expecting our health, our community to have confidence in people in relation to that, which means that sort of like tools like yours coming in, and some of the other tools out there are a really positive thing. Now, part of the 10-year plan, I think the NHS are proposing that they're bringing back. We had the app library before, and now they're calling the HealthStore in relation to that, where you'll have sort of nice approved sort of like tools in relation to that. Is that something that's on your roadmap, or that you'd like to see sort of Medeskin AI?
I would like to see it, as someone who's been dealing with the NHS the past few years.
Yeah.
I liken it to sort of a jar of marbles, where sort of all of the things are contained within the broad category of NHS, but to really get anything out there, you sort of have to stick your hand deep in and really hope for the best, in terms of if the right marble you've picked out is the one you need. So I'm very, again, it's another positive thing. I think the HealthStore is a step in the right direction. I personally am not very familiar with the app with the App Store is what you mentioned. So
Yeah,
I
the
believe
app
that was
library. It
discontinued
sort
in
of
2021, I believe.
yeah, it came and went, Shamoun. It was sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
like, we had the NHS app library, which again didn't sort of it. I don't think the promotion of it was
Hmm.
very well sort of, and the take up in relation to that. I don't think it was mobilised.
Okay.
It wasn't implemented well. I don't
Right.
think for health organisations
Gotcha.
to sort of utilise in
No, because
relation to that.
quite frankly, I'm not too familiar with why that did not work out. So I can't speak,
Hmm.
for
No.
anything other than sort of, maybe not repeat the mistakes that were previously, that caused the it not to work out essentially. But yeah, that I think the health store as a general, I think would really help businesses such as myself or such as mine, to really get out there because even now it is quite fragmented in terms of approaching the right people, approaching the right organizations, for lack of a better term, um, groups to really get this app out there. I mean, I've been doing this for what, 2.5 years. And every time I approach someone and they're like, okay, wait, you might want to head one level above me, you might want to head one level above me. And I think the constant changing environment does not make it easy either. Even now, I mean, my roadmap is constantly strained and tested every few months because they might have a small change here, they might have a small change there. I believe recently I noticed that they were changing parts of DTAC as well, or they are
Yes,
in the process of
they are.
changing DTAC. And
Yeah.
you know, as you're aware, we are sort of, working on DTAC, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it kind of leaves a big gap in terms of, okay, I need to continue. However, I don't know when this change might take place, what the change would be. So I don't know where I put my time and money, sort of going into it. And I think these things are kind of what would make or break all of these plans that they have in store for the NHS as a whole.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I completely agree with you. And look, as we know, we support you guys as an organisation in relation to your regulatory compliance, and it's just as hard for us, Shamoun, in relation to that because you're absolutely right. DTAC is changing, and unless it's sort of a big PR campaign to actually get out there and them saying this is coming, please be aware of it, and these are the changes.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it,
Mhm.
and and it is very difficult for those organisations that are trying to get a foothold and trying to sort of gain traction, and then all of a sudden you've got the NHS saying, oh, by the way, there's more regulation, or the regulation's changing, so that's going to have an impact on you
Correct.
in relation to what you're doing. And you'd like to think that the realization's there in relation to that. I think sort of on a positive note, I don't think the changes to DTAC are going to have any huge sort of
Sure.
impact. I think what they're doing is just trying to align the message and get the actual implementation of it correct in relation to the ask, and be a bit clearer with some implementation guidance as
Mhm.
well
And
in
that will be a
relation to
huge
that.
step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it needs to be positive in relation to that. And, we're seeing sort of, around the innovation passport that they're looking at. And I know the first examples that came out around that, there was some LinkedIn posts, and it was very much aligned with physical devices, because the two examples that we used were around surgical dressings, and the uptake of some of those innovations. But then obviously all of those people in the digital health community are asking the question, well, is the innovation password or passport going to be sort of related to digital health technologies?
Mhm.
And is there going to be an expectation that you can just have your technology assessed by one organization, they give it the rubber stamp, and then all of a sudden it's implemented with anger across many other organizations? And as we know, um, there are implications in relation to that, because not all health organisations, as we know, work in the same way. So it has to be sort of assessed on merit for each organisation.
Right.
But look, we're seeing a lot of these, and I think you sit firmly in that AI space, and as you've noticed, there's been sort of huge acceleration in relation to AI and what we're seeing. So we've got, ambient voice technologies around here, ambient voice transcription, lots of stuff in the press around that. NHS England brought the statement out, generative AI and beyond. There's ethical and practical implications around sort of AVT in consultations, etc. And again, sort of, where do you find yourself positioned in relation to that? Because, do you feel that there may be an ask to sort of like, you already stated that, if there is interest in your technology, then are you going to have organizations and trusts? Because it's there, isn't it? It's in the forefront of their mind, and they're potentially going to be asking you these questions. Oh, do you support? So, if I want to put a consultation note into your application, where on your roadmap is AVT, or where on your roadmap is generative AI, etc. So how do you prepare or position yourself in relation to that?
So yeah, AVT is quite new, even for me. I mean, we've sort of kept up with what's happening in and around. So I will say we are working in partnership with a level 7, I believe it's called stage 7. Apologies if I mislabel it. Hospital management information systems. So they are based in India, and they are, oddly enough, also looking into AVT technology. And they'd approached, Medeskin AI to see, or essentially trial their systems in terms of how it works. I think with the, I apologize, I'm forgetting the name of it, but I believe they're changing the ERP for patients as well with the 10-year plan. The patient record, I believe they're updating it to be a singular record of sorts. However, I will have to check up on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The single care record is something that's been an initiative within the UK for sort of for a number of years. Whether we get there or not, sort of like in relation to like the EPR. And I think you were absolutely right about your HIMSS level 7 in relation to that, in relation to that organisation. So you are potentially partnering with.
We're exploring sort of options on how that can work together. So I will say that right now we are purely image based. That's the only sort of model that, it's the only parameter that the model takes into consider something. Now, part of these trials that we're running, we're also gathering more data points, for example, which are DICOM compliant. For example, your age, your locality, the Fitzpatrick scale, which is sort of a scale for your skin tone, because of course that makes a big difference as well. And the idea is to sort of implement all of these different parameters in slow and steady. The data available just simply wasn't there at the time to be able to do this. And I think with AVT, if it is done correctly, I think that could only further bolster, our model as well. And I think it could really enhance the level of care because you have this system that's sort of able to get a much more holistic approach about the patient. And it's not necessarily just, a couple of if tables on, all right, they have this, they have this, they have this, therefore they might have this. I think ethically, we've always been pretty ethic focused forward in terms of how we approach these things. Even before we started our beta, our very first thing that we made sure was to have as many skin tones as we could. make sure that we had a wide age range, and really be sure that we're in line with sort of the ethical aspects of how we
Yeah.
are treating the data, how we are using this data for learning. I mean, even at this early stage, when I'm running these observational studies in India, which I will say is a bit more lax in terms of kind of taking into account all of these things. We prepared information booklets in I think now it's in 4 different languages,
Okay.
to be sure that the participants, the patients themselves, are 100% aware of how we're treating their data, what we're doing with it, and their consent is informed throughout. And it's the same thing with the doctors, right? So even when we have doctors come on board to trial our app, we have to be sure that we're setting the expectations correct, and that we even as a company sort of respect and understand the biases that may come into play. The really, and I mean, even down to sort of, it's not a technological bias, of course. I'm speaking, even, let's say my app predicts condition Y, the doctor says it's condition X. Expectations have to be managed where the doctor does not question themselves, because at the end of the day, it is an AI technology. It is 100% possible for it to misdiagnose. And I think that's why, right from the beginning, it's always been about try to get over as many hurdles as you can. And for the hurdles that are still on the way, really highlight them, recognize them, and be sure that everyone, from patient to doctor, any stakeholder, is 100% aware of the risks and the issues going in.
And that's music to my ears, and sort of as you know, from a regulatory perspective, and we've sort of like been addressing this sort of stuff, but it brings to the forefront, doesn't it, Shamoun, the whole healthcare inequalities,
Absolutely,
and trying to address that, because as we know, there are underserved and there are remote communities as well that should have access to these technologies.
Absolutely.
And also, we shouldn't forget about those communities when we're looking at our data models, and we're looking at sort of like mitigating bias, especially in relation to that. So, you've already sort of talked about sort of like clinical trials and sort of like observational studies, etc., in relation to that. And is there any sort of specific healthcare institutions that you are sort of like working with, or sort of dermatology or sort of associations, or anything that you've sort of like that you've reached out to in relation to application?
Yeah, so in we're working, well, I believe they're renamed now, but at the time we'd applied through NHSX. I believe they're just called NHS Digital at this point. So we're working with they renamed themselves as well, the Health Innovations Oxford and Thames Valley, and they treat the northeast region, just above London, and we're working in partnership with them to sort of help us integrate into the NHS. And they really have helped highlight a lot of the issues along the way as well. Working in partnership with the ICB for BOB, which is Berkshire, Oxford, and another place I forget. And yeah, I've gotten positive feedback. However, once again, I sort of run into some issues with the regulatory aspects of it, because, once again, putting my hand into the jar of marbles, I could get the ICBs, but they might be connected to something else, which, sort of goes back into this feedback loop. And I found that a bit challenging in the UK. However, outside, it is a bit easier, I would say. I've also worked with so Medicine Sans Frontières, MSF. They were part of a consortium to push out a data set for skin conditions, specifically treating NTDs, which is non-topical diseases, tropical. Apologies. I use so many acronyms at this point that I forget what they what they might represent.
We love an acronym in the NHS, yeah.
But essentially, yes, I've worked with them. They've also highlighted sort of the the need for this. As part of the consortium, I also worked with representatives from the World Health Organization. They are also working in a similar field, in a similar tool, just slightly different than ours. And of course, with hospitals that focus solely on dermatology in India. So at the moment, we are running trials with a doctor based in Northwest India, and so far, it's fingers crossed, it's going pretty well.
Brilliant. No, that's absolutely fantastic. And you've mentioned around a lot of the work you're doing in making sure that sort of like with your data models and sort of like trustworthy, and the efficacy in relation to that, and addressing bias. Do you feel that sort of like with all of this, I think the layperson that's out there in relation to sort of taking on a lot of these technologies and all of these phrases sort of like that are very unfamiliar to the majority of people. What are you doing within sort of like within Medeskin, and are you sort of like actively conscious of this in relation to sort of like the user interface and the user experience in relation to that explainability, etc., within the platform?
So yeah, it's an ongoing thing, really, because when you're in the field, you sort of forget or tend to forget things that you treat as common knowledge, but might not be. I mean, having studied AI, I sort of take some things for granted. Even the definition of artificial intelligence, I take it for granted. I understand kind of what goes into it. So when I put out these, for example, my information booklet, it is very different what it is today than sort of my very first draft of it. And I think the only reason it became that sort of friendly is just really including patients and the layperson along the way. I mean, for me personally, it was explaining it to my grandparents. Trying to explain AI to them, making them familiar with the topic, it really helped me understand kind of how to bridge that gap. But it is very important. And I mean, now, people might ask my grandparents, hey, what does Shamoun, do nowadays? And my grandparents are honestly quite easily able to explain what AI is, and what exactly they do. So so even when I put out these booklets or any other sort of media that might be patient facing, I make sure to ask as many people as I can of different ages, teenagers, adults, older, 60 plus, 65 plus. And so even though Medeskin AI is UK based, and we are working with the NHS here, we're also working, as I mentioned, in India, and we're trying to get into different markets as well, to run these trials. And every time a new region comes up, there's additional sort of hurdles in explaining and helping them understand kind of what we do. I think with the recent boom of AI, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It has become a little easier to explain what we're doing, but at the same time, because generative AI is what's at the forefront, image analytics becomes a little bit challenging to explain kind of how it might work and things like that. But I would say, yeah, in the last 2 to 3 years, it's definitely been a lot easier to explain artificial intelligence to people and sort of help them get the point across. But it really, I mean, it's a no-brainer to include as many different people as you can in all of these things that you put out, and be sure that your messaging is on point to be explainable to anyone.
And I think it's interesting when you mention the double-edged sword, because I think that also goes for sort of like, social media in relation to AI as well, because there's good and bad stories, isn't there, and messages that are put out. And I think it's very difficult sometimes, isn't it, for the community and our population to sort of like, where do you put your trust in relation to that, when we're seeing more and more clinicians that want to put their trust in AI. Sometimes we're not. My experiences are that sometimes they're not going for the low hanging fruit, and they're not going for some of these applications like and I'll put you firmly in that sort of place that can that could improve efficiencies and cost savings in relation to that. Can speed up sort of like triage, where you've got overburdened referral systems and services anyway. And we need to start looking at those sort of like those options, which sort of leads me on to sort of from a strategic fit in sort of like the whole NHS use cases. We're seeing more and more of these sort of like where we're moving from, or trying to move from hospital to community and into prevention, that triage systems are absolutely paramount in relation to that. So do you see sort of like Medeskin, sort of like AI being sort of like, having sort of potentially strategic partnerships with those sort of organizations?
So absolutely. Even sort of at the time of conceiving sort of the business, the use case and all of that, we had plans to implement wearable tech. We had plans to implement all of these additional data coming in from other service providers. I think the challenge, and I think it's becoming easier now, is, well, again, I think it's a double-edged sword. Well, I'll get to that. I think the challenge is essentially really getting that data in the first place and treating that data correctly. First of all, it's not really available online to make these connections anywhere, right? So you have to be willing to put in that time to sort of, for example, all right, let's take wearable tech like your watch. Now that has your heartbeat sensor, it does your O2, and a handful of other things, I'm sure. These things can be linked to, I would say, every single, health condition out there. However, there is very limited data available that a model could learn from at the moment out there. And I ran into that issue too, right? At the time of getting these images, because I briefly mentioned that right now it's only images solely because I didn't have these extra parameters available to me. And I think with more uptake of technology, with more uptake of people being comfortable using these applications, monitoring their health better, going to pushing for a more preventative rather than diagnostic or treatment care, I think that data coming in is only going to strengthen healthcare as a whole. But I also believe it's quite important that the data be handled correctly, because that is quite powerful information to have, especially considering and I forgot it again, the single patient record,
single patient record,
which is a doorway to patient history, patient information, everything. At a glance, it's very easy to have a look at. So I think it's important to have, again, to have these collaborations. It's on our roadmap. However, we really need to be careful on and perform the due diligence to make sure that all of this data is shared correctly, stored correctly, and is in line with regulations. People in my personal circle know that I complain a lot about regulations. However, I complain about the headache it is, but I absolutely agree with sort of everything that goes in there, because especially in healthcare, it is just paramount importance to treat all of these things correctly.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree with you. Look, we sort of, I think within our daily lives, don't we? We all have a moan about sort of certain regulations, etc., and sort of like things that are put in place that seem to be like, and look, we've been working in regulatory compliance now for quite a while, and sometimes you're seen as a blocker in relation to all you're doing is just stifling what we're trying to do to move forward. At a cost as well in relation to that. But I think you're absolutely right. We're at a point at the moment with artificial intelligence where there's lots happening. We are, especially and just sort of focusing on the UK market, is that we have standards that we're aware of. None are mandated at the moment. So there's obviously lots of people out there that are sitting and waiting to see what happens, because there's lots of talk around, the UK government have already made a blueprint of the EU AI Act. And, we're all sitting here saying, when's that going to be switched on? Because obviously, we know now it's mandated in the EU. Which means that, firmly, if you look at sort of, the sections in relation to the medical device regulation, that sits all AI as a medical device as a class 2A in relation to that. And as you know, Shamoun, and as I know, that has massive implications in relation to your roadmap and how you plan in relation to sort of, what you're trying to achieve. And coming onto that and the challenges that that you've faced as a health tech startup, having to navigate the NHS procurement process, demonstrate clinical and economic value in relation to that, and building trust as well, isn't it, in relation to that? So, what if you could tell the audience, what have your experiences been, and what are the sort of like the challenges to date that you've had to face in relation to that?
Honestly, I think the biggest challenge would just be how slow moving I find a lot of processes to take. Regulations aside, I mean, that of course needs time, care. That's one thing. But even sort of getting, little things done really takes a while. Now, you mentioned the change of EU MDR, or well, in the UK, for the MDR for class 2 regulations. I think for us, it was actually a little easier because we were always class 2. And I think another thing that helped us was that with my medical knowledge, because a lot of the processes, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the designs that went in were already influenced by knowledge that I knew as a medical trainee, let's say. That sort of, I mean, with all of the regulations, with all of the MDR, everything, traceability and usability, all of those things, they were already integrated into our systems early on without us realizing that, that might be something that would affect us down the line. And I think that makes, at least from Medeskin AI's perspective, it makes our roadmap essentially similar, just sort of keeping an eye out for anything new that might not have already existed. So I think that's been, I mean, I would say that really helped. So a lot of the challenges that we face were just the slow moving nature of healthcare. But I don't see that as, something to necessarily complain about too much, just because the the medical side of me understands that it's quite important, but the business facing side of me, is warring on, all right, let's get this going. Let's get this done. From a procurement, again, it's challenging in getting those health economics done and your adoptability report. I am hopeful that the HealthStore sort of does help with streamlining that process. Less about the end result of the HealthStore and more so about really highlighting in detail kind of the process that will go into it in the first place. So even in my case, because I'm not of the NHS by any means, I did not have many connections into the NHS, save a GP or two going in. So I had to learn a lot of it on the fly, and it is, again, I mentioned it earlier too, it is vast. So I think for businesses to have something that really highlights, here is what you need to get in, here is how you can get it, and the end result is the end result. I think that would really help us. I mean, you've been, and I've told you about this as well, but even in our working relation, you have helped, guide a lot of stuff for us anyway. Even I mean, you were a registered nurse, if I remember correct. So
yes, yeah,
even getting your inputs from that perspective has really helped us sort of navigate the environment. But I will say that comes down to because having spoken to you, it is not information that is easily available out there.
No.
And if you don't know what you're looking for, it's hard to find it in the first place.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I have to agree with you, Shamoun. And I don't. It still baffles me to why we make it so difficult for entrepreneurs, innovators within the UK market. It's almost as if we're hell bent on stifling innovation in relation to what we're doing, and I just find it sort of really, really hard. And I think it makes our conversations with some innovators out there even more difficult, because sometimes they say, well, you're a big part of the problem because you're supporting the regulations and the ask of the sort of like the government and of the NHS in relation to what we're doing. And it's like, people sometimes don't see you as part of the solution, but as you just said, we come with sort of years of experience, and we can steer people in the right direction and give them advice and guidance and support in relation to sort of what they need to do and where they need to go. But I don't think there's like you've said, I think especially within the sort of the research and innovation areas, there's we're lacking in relation to being able to give, there's like you say, core information in relation to, here's the regulatory roadmap, here's the information in relation to that, here is a lot of the opportunities, and here's the contact details for those people that you can go to get advice and guidance, or if you want to talk about grant applications, frameworks, opportunities, etc. You have to do a lot of
I will
digging.
just add a little bit as well. So as part of NHS Digital, and I get emails from them in terms of changes to their services, changes to any sort of technologies that I've been using as part of NHS Digital. Now, I know, and here's the kicker, is in sort of speaking with you, even sort of in, let's say, a little bit of preparation for this podcast to some degree, I learned a lot more of the changes that the government is implementing solely because this is something, or it was the podcast and you that sort of led that change. So even though I'm part of NHS Digital, they claim to help, businesses and to sort of really implement themselves into the ecosystem. I don't get any of this information from them, and it's always left to really the mercy of finding out when this change is going to happen, either through random chance, such as this,
Yeah.
or when you let me know that, hey, there's definitely a new thing that's come out. We are now changing that. And I mean, personally, of course, it's a bit challenging. I understand I'm not the one, who has to necessarily go out there and apply to ISO, go out there and do all of these things. I rely heavily on you. However, as the decision maker, it is still quite important for me to know, to some degree, of understand what the ecosystem looks like, to then, steer my decisions in the right direction accordingly. And I think it's a missed opportunity to sort of not include these things. It is a fine line to not inundate, me with unnecessary information. However, I think having any sort of information on these changes would really help.
And you're absolutely right, but I think we're at a crossroads at the moment with NHS England, which we know are going, and it's going to be devolved into the Department of Health and Social Care. And I think we're all sitting here, Shamoun, asking what is that going to look like?
Mm-hmm.
But what we are all doing as well is trying to push the point and to keep banging that drum in relation to the innovators, entrepreneurs, all those sort of organisations within digital health need support, need more guidance. So I'm really hopeful that with some of the initiatives that are coming in, the Innovators Passport, and changes to the regulations, that those changes are going to be positive changes, and that we're actually going to see more support for innovators in relation to what we're doing, and that we can see positive change, and it'll be absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So, sort of on that note, Shamoun, I think it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you, and for having this opportunity to be able to get you on the podcast. It's been really interesting, and it's always good to talk about sort of like the technologies that are available and that are coming out, and your experiences. Now, before you go though, I do this with all of my sort of guests. It's just mildly putting you on the spot in relation to, if there's, from our conversations and what we've discussed, etc., if there's one takeaway that you could sort of like give in relation to your experience, what would that be?
To who? My question is to who? I mean, other innovators? Is it
to the audience, whether it's to other innovators, to the healthcare community, to sort of like to the people out there?
I think my main I think the main message would definitely be that even though it is excruciatingly painful at times, it is truly sort of humbling and impressive to some degree as well to see the level of innovation that's out there, and as well as the help, especially you. I mean, just because you've helped me along this path quite a lot with regulations. And my point is that even though all of these things are quite painful, once you're on the other side, or once you sort of understand the reasoning and the sort of the context behind all of these things, it really does put into perspective why and how you're doing these things. It really does. I mean, just a small tangent. I mean, for example, right? We worked on our clinical risk management, and you have these ideas in mind in terms of, okay, we need a clinical risk management. Sure, it needs to sort of have these certain things that you want to look out for. The things you sort of think of as a patient, things you think of as a doctor. But when you really get down into the nitty-gritty, you really do understand the level of thought, the level of care, the level of, really effort that goes into making a decision and ensuring that you, as a healthcare or health tech company or solution, whatever you are, really take into consideration everything because it is an important field, and you need to be sure that what you're doing is just on point.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And that's a great message to end this episode on. So I'd just like to say thank you ever so much, Shamoun, for joining us
Thank you so
on
much for having me.
episode 27 of The Only Way is Ethics. And thank you to the audience out there for listening. And if anyone's got any questions for Shamoun or for me, please reach out when we put the episode out, which will be later in the week. Thank you again, and you have a good rest of your day.
Likewise.